Long over 100 years ago, the kingdom of Ilé-Aiyé did not just fall, it was erased. They say to this day some people have been said to have seen a flash of a white Iro and Buba, so bright it hurt the eyes. It was Olori Adunni, the bride who was supposed to unite two warring crowns. Instead, she became the sacrifice that fed the greed of a king who wanted power more than he wanted a daughter-in-law. They buried her alive beneath the throne room, her mouth sewn shut with silver thread so her screams wouldn't reach the ears of the Orishas. They thought silence was safety. They were wrong. Because Adunni's jaw opened for the first time ever after 100 years. The metal fell to the floor of her tomb like dry rain. She didn't crawl, she simply rose. The red earth of Ilé-Aiyé moved out of her way like a frightened dog. She walked straight into the palace. The new King Adeyemi sat on his throne, laughing and drinking. He didn't notice the room turning cold until his breath turned into a cloud of ice. He looked up and saw her. She was a ghost in a glowing white Iro and Buba. Her face was beautiful but terrifying, marked by the scars where the thread had been. "Who are you?" The king shook, reaching for his blade. Adunni did not answer with words. She leaned over him and the smell of old dust filled his lungs. She touched his golden crown and the gold turned into black slime. It dripped onto the floor, soaking into the very dirt of the kingdom. She placed a curse on the land right there. She decided that from that moment, nothing would ever grow tall in Ilé-Aiyé again. The yams would rot in the dirt. The rain would miss their farms. Worst of all, she took their fame. She made it so that no matter how hard they worked, the world would always forget they existed. The king tried to shout for his guard, but his throat felt tight, like someone was sewing it shut down from inside. Adunni walked out of the palace and through the city gates. As she passed, the green trees turned grey and died. The river dried up into a bed of cracked mud. By the time the sun came up, the great kingdom was just a collection of hungry people and silent houses. Drought was not the first sign of Adunni's curse. It was the screaming walls of the palace. Every night, Adeyemi sat in his palace and heard a muffled scratching and loud screams coming from the walls. To stop these screams, he offered sacrifices to the Orishas, Oya, Oshun, Obatala, even Shango, but his sacrifices, hundreds of white rams and jars of the finest oil, sat rotting at the shrines. The Orishas had turned their backs. The gods did not want his gifts, they wanted the truth. Desperate and terrified, Adeyemi summoned the oldest palace historian, a man whose eyes were clouded with age. "Why is the earth eating my kingdom?" Adeyemi demanded, his voice shaking. The old man sighed. It began with a lie and a pile of gold. 100 years ago, the kingdom of Ilé-Aiyé was poor while the neighboring crown was drowning in gold. To fix this, the old king, Adeyemi's grandfather, arranged a marriage. He promised his son to Adunni, the daughter of the wealthy neighboring king. Adunni arrived at the border with a dowry that filled 50 wagons, gold bars, ivory, and precious gems. But the old king was a man of dark greed. He realized that if the marriage happened, the wealth would belong to the couple. If Adunni disappeared before the wedding, he could claim the dowry as a gift of mourning and keep it all for himself. The sun had set on the most beautiful celebration Ilé-Aiyé had ever seen. A feast to welcome the crown prince's new wife, Adunni. All day the drums had thundered. Adunni had danced until her feet were red with dust, cheered on by the very men who had already dug her grave. The king and his son, Prince Ajani, had planned the theatre perfectly. They welcomed Adunni's caravan with open arms, showering her with praise. Ajani, her betrothed, held her hand and whispered promises of a glorious future. He wasn't just a witness to the plot, he was its architect. He wanted the throne more than he wanted a wife, and he knew his father's treasury was empty. They fed her the finest pounded yam and served her palm wine laced with herbs to make her limbs heavy. By the time the moon was high, Adunni was in a deep, drugged sleep in the royal guest chamber. At midnight, the music stopped. The co-conspirators, 3 hand-picked elders who stood to gain from the stolen wealth, crept into her room. They didn't use a coffin. They used a heavy rug to roll her up like a piece of furniture. They carried her to the foundation of the new throne room. As the drugs began to wear off, Adunni's eyes fluttered open. She saw Ajani standing above the pit, holding a torch. She tried to scream his name, but the royal blacksmith was already there. With cold, trembling hands, they pulled the silver thread through her lips. It was a ritual of silence. They believed that if a person died without a voice, their spirit would be trapped in the dark forever. They lowered her into the hole while she was still breathing, her eyes wide with the betrayal of the man that she loved. They shoveled the red earth over her face, and then the king himself laid the first stone of the floor. When the news reached Adunni's people that their daughter had died of a sudden fever just before the wedding, the land of the wealthy neighbors turned grey with grief. Her father fell from his stool, his heart broken, but her mother, a woman who knew the weight of her daughter's soul, did not believe the lie. She traveled to the gates of Ilé-Aiyé to demand the body. She was met with cold nonchalance. The king of Ilé-Aiyé sat on his new throne, picking his teeth, while the elders yawned and spoke of the will of the gods. They didn't even pretend to be sad. They had the gold. They no longer needed the girl. Adunni's mother walked away from the mocking laughter of the palace and went down to the banks of the Osun River. She tore her clothes and threw her head tie into the water. She didn't pray for a quick death. She prayed for a slow justice. "Osun, mother of the deep," she cried, her voice cracking the silence of the forest. "If my daughter truly died of a fever, let Ilé-Aiyé grow fat and peaceful. Let their children many and their barns be full. But if her blood was spilled for gold, if her mouth was sewn shut by the hands of greedy men, then let the earth remember. If Adunni died by their hand, let her return. Even if it takes 100 years for the silver to break, let her rise and pull the foundation out from under them." The river bubbled and turned a dark, bruised purple. The Orishas had heard. For 100 years, the descendants of the king and the 3 elders lived on the stolen gold, thinking that they had escaped. They didn't realize that every year they spent in luxury was just a loan that Adunni would eventually collect with interest. Your grandfather and his cohorts buried her alive directly under the throne so the king could sit on top of his secrets. He built his empire on her golden dowry, and for 100 years, the kingdom thrived on stolen wealth. The old man concluded. Adeyemi listened, but he did not feel pity. He only felt annoyed. "If it is just a ghost," Adeyemi spat, "then I will dig her up and burn the bones." He grabbed a shovel and began to dig into the palace floor, driven by his own greed to find whatever gold might be left in her tomb. But as he dug, the ground didn't give way to dirt. It gave way to white cloth. Adunni rose, the silver threads hanging from her face like jewelry. She looked at Adeyemi and saw the same greedy eyes as his grandfather. Adeyemi tried to call his guard, but he realized his tongue had turned to lead. He had spent his reign taxing the poor into starvation and taking wives by force. He was no better than the man who buried her. When he reached for his charms to protect himself, the beads turned to dust. The Orishas had watched him for years, and they found him unworthy of mercy. Adunni did not kill him. She simply stood on the ruins of the throne and watched as the kingdom's walls began to melt like salt in the rain. The glory of Ilé-Aiyé was built on a stolen dowry, so Adunni took the value out of everything. To this day, the descendants of that land find that money slips through their fingers. A man from that lineage can be born into a house of stone and end his life in a hut of grass. The kingdom did not fall. It became a place where effort produces nothing. The people moved away, leaving Adeyemi to rule over a city of dust and silence, with only the ghost of the bride to keep him company. Other kingdoms stopped coming to trade. The roads to Ilé-Aiyé grew over with thorns. The city didn't die in a war, it just withered away like a plant with no water. To this day, if you travel near that old land, the soil is still a strange cursed red. No one builds there. The locals say that if you try to start a business or a farm on that ground, it will fail within a year. Adunni is still there, sitting at the edge of the ruins, making sure her silence stays the loudest thing in the history of the kingdom.